Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the second chapter in the book of James. Now, we divided the first chapter into two sections, two lessons, the first of which was the first 15 verses, the final of which was 16 through 27, but there is something that does echo in the earlier portion, which I want to read in my review, verses 9 and 10. And let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. He who is poor in the world but rich in the spirit is going to be better off. They have a lot more to boast of than those who have plenty and abundance of that which vanishes and fades. So that's what he's speaking about, his exaltation. And it is easier for a camel to pass through the needle of an eye than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom. Yet through God all things are possible. So if you are rich, that is not an automatic barrier to the kingdom. You know, you can have possessions, and God's not against you having things. He's just against things having you. If you can have possessions without being possessed on it, then you are good. But the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he shall pass away. This humility is reflected in the book of Ecclesiastes by Solomon, the wisest as well as wealthiest man in the world. But he had the humility. He was humbled by the impending hour of his death, the imminence of his death. He is at death's door. But why should the rich be humiliated? He who exalts himself shall be abased, and he who abased himself shall be exalted. And his life's going to vanish just like the flower in the field. It's going to vanish in the sun. So too will a rich man fade away in his ways. Verse 19, so then, my beloved brothers, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Listening is half the equation in any conversation, and I think it's frequently underlooked and neglected. The natural man delights in talking, but the Christian should delight in hearing, listening, and learning, paying attention, giving everyone in the room the respect with the attention, the full focus that they deserve, and then, speak when the moment is right. It will come eventually, and that's when you say. But the other thing he warns against is, just being slow to wrath as well as slow to speak. So wrath is nowhere good. Now, it does not work the righteousness of Elohim. That's why it's bad. And wrath is his prerogative. His wrath is righteous because everything that he is and does is righteous. But our wrath, there's an unrighteous element in our wrath. It's motivated by envy rather than jealousy, and just selfishness rather than, the Creator reserves the right to be disappointed with his fallen and wayward creation. But he also talks about just doing the spiritual inventory that removes the pollutant, the filthiness, and evil in our hearts so we can make room in it for the Word. But once the Word is there, we will give witness that it is manifest and living in our hearts by doing. So the value of the word comes from the doing and not the hearing. He earlier said be swift to hear. So we have to pay attention when this word is read and everything else and when we're reading it. But also, go out and do what you read about doing in here. And become doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. The professing Christian, as opposed to the possessing Christian, the professing Christian is a self-deceived, deluded one who thinks it's enough to say the right things and just have the pious-sounding platitudes, be fluent in the language of Christianese, but then not get into the mud, not get into the gutter, not do the work that needs to be done. They are deceiving themselves, and they are probably deceiving others through their eloquence of language. They can be adept. The lip service religion, some of them can give a pretty good talk, but at the end of the day, they are a self-deceived deception of others. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. James is writing from a very Jewish perspective. The Gentiles were not yet the majority of Christianity at the writing of this. This is the earliest written example of New Testament literature, dated to the year circa AD 45. So the mirror, now the law of Moses functions as a mirror. It exposes our sin and exposes the pollutants we have to get rid of in order for the the word to grow and blossom and bloom in our hearts, because these other elements, the evil and all the stuff, worries of the age, that chokes out the word. But it becomes a mirror. But the problem with the mirror is that, think of the cleaning process. You see yourself, your face in the mirror, but the mirror cannot wash the dirt from your face. So something else has to do that, and that is faith. But faith without works is dead, as he makes known in the section we're going to cover after the section we covered today. In the second chapter, we're going to cut at the exact midway point. Verse 13, we'll get there when we get there, but he that looked into the perfect Torah, that of freedom, and continues in it, not becoming a hearer that forgets, but a doer of works, this one shall be blessed in the doing. So it's an action-oriented faith. We will be blessed in the process and in the doing, and it's a present reality that echoes when we are doing good. But to look in the perfect Torah, the Torah is perfect. It is a reflection and revelation of the perfect will and the intrinsic righteousness of the Almighty, but it's also a mirror which exposes our imperfection. So there's nothing wrong with the law in itself. What's wrong is the law breaker, and James comments on this in the chapter we're going to cover today. But if you hear, now sitting through a sermon or being in a Bible lesson is useless if you forget what you hear, and the way that you translate your knowledge is through action, by getting there and actually doing the things you learned from a sermon or a Bible study. And he speaks in the 26th verse of the all talk, no action Christian. Now, it's not enough that we say the right things and do the right things. We also have to not say the wrong things, else it nullifies our religion. It gives the world license to label us and tar us as hypocrites. But clean and undefiled religion before the Elohim and Father is this: to visit the orphans and the widows in their affliction, to keep oneself unstained from the world. So two things. He's talking about a pure religion. Now, religion is prone to contamination, corruption, hypocrisy. Religion is a dirty word, even amongst religious circles. What do we Christians prefer to say? We don't preach religion, we preach relationship. But there is such a thing as religion that is untainted, and the way that it is found is by visiting the orphans and the widows, the most vulnerable, the fatherless, the husbandless, those without a male protector, who in the ancient agrarian society had no means of livelihood in their affliction. Now, where there is orphans and where there are widows, there is an affliction. Just the loss of a father or a husband is a devastating, traumatic event for either of these people to deal with. But also keeping oneself away from the world. He comments on this in the 4th chapter, 4th verse. Know ye that friendship with the world renders one an enemy of Elohim. So we got to keep ourselves stained. The world around us is not a friendly place, and it is where the pollutants seep in that contaminate our hearts and compromise our faith. First verse, 2nd chapter. My brothers, do not hold the faith of our Master Yahshua Messiah, the Master of esteem, with partiality. Partiality is inconsistent with the character, nature, and behavior of the namesake of our religion, the Master Yahshua Messiah, the Master of esteem, because he broke down, even in his birth, he broke down the barriers between educated and uneducated, rich and poor, male and female, slave and free. And after his life, he broke down the barrier, the wall between the Jews and the Gentiles. So he is also... Elohim, is he only the Elohim of the Jews or the Gentiles, and in him is no partiality? Peter comes to this conclusion after being visited by the dream, which prompts the conversion of Cornelius. And plenty of Paul's writing says that Elohim is not an Elohim of partiality. And also Deuteronomy 1:17, the Israelites were commanded to reflect his impartiality in the execution of their justice. So partiality is a vice that we do well to avoid like the plague. This is prejudice. This is the things we entered into, the assumptions, the unexamined assumptions, which create fear and confusion about the people we have to interact with. So impartiality is a virtue. That is the indiscriminate assessment of people based on their merit and value. For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and a splendid robe, and there shall also come in a poor one dressed in rags, and you pay attention to the one wearing the splendid robe, and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor one, you stand there, or sit here by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with wicked thoughts? That's a single sentence. That's the second through the fourth verse. We're going to break it down. From the top, James describes a realistic hypothetical of just this glaring discrepancy between the wealth of one congregant and the lack thereof of another entering into the same. So some people, their Sunday best is not our Sunday best, and we have to, respect them. Don't judge a man based on their clothes, because the partiality in humans, the natural man, they seek to favor the rich because they think they can get something out of them, whereas they don't want to be embarrassed by deigning to the poor. But the Christian is called to a higher ethic. It is to approach one equally and all the same. Don't be seduced by the clothing that they're wearing or their resources or lack thereof, because what do we read in the previous chapter? The lowly brother is exalted and the rich is humiliated. And so, if you draw attention and pay attention and just cater to the rich man, but seemingly at the expense of the poor man's, and assign seating. Now, what does the master himself say? Remember, this is the religion of the master, the impartiality we are called to cultivate. He discourages against the common practice of jockeying for the best seat in the house, the best seat in the synagogue. This is the way of the Pharisees and the Gentiles. So assigned seating as a general rule is a good approach to churches. First come, first serve, whether you are rich or poor, and sit whoever deems to sit next to you in the order they arrive. Don't tell a poor person to get away from me and make room for the rich. That's just the wrong thing to do in so many ways. It's self-evidently so. And in doing so, you are guilty of the sin of discrimination. Now, discrimination, one of the evils of postmodernism is indiscriminate tolerance. So discrimination, now it is an oversimplification to say that we should do without discrimination altogether. There is such thing as healthy discrimination. This is the discernment that leads to the discretion that keeps us away from evil and keeps us from doing evil. But James ties it in the emotion, the motivating and animating spirit is that of wicked thoughts. So these wicked thoughts are springing to and affecting your body. So as a man thinks, so he does. So get your thoughts. Thoughts are ground zero in our spiritual warfare. So get rid of wicked thoughts. And an 18th century Jewish rabbi compared the man's mind to the holy of holies, and allowing or admitting entrance into an unclean thought was like setting up idol in the temple of God. Listen, my beloved brothers, has Elohim not chosen the poor of this world, rich in faith, and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? Has not Elohim chosen the foolish of the world to shame the wise, and the poor? Those who are poor, those who are despised, those who are foolish, those who are rejected are the ones he has called and chosen. Paul communicates in 1 Corinthians 1. So the poor are special. They are held. He is affectionately invested in their eternal welfare. But he who is poor in the world, who does not have worldly trappings or resources or possession, but is rich in faith, the treasures of the kingdom of heaven are not subject. They are impervious to decay, rust, corruption. No thief can steal them. These are something that belong to you eternally. So between the wealth of the world and the treasures of heaven, there's no qualitative comparison. Sadly, those who walk by sight as opposed to faith covet and strive after the accumulation of worldly wealth, and in the process often forsake the integrity of their faith. But he also speaks of the kingdom which is promised. The kingdom is a future expectation, but it's also a present reality. And if we are praying for the ultimate fulfillment of the kingdom, which is the second coming, the kingdom comes when the king returns to the earth. This will launch the seventh and final dispensation, the millennial one, of which we read of in the 20th chapter in the book of Revelation. But we have to live as if live as if he was crucified yesterday, live as if he was resurrected today, and live as if he was returning tomorrow, as Martin Luther said. So keep the promise now, work towards the expectation. If we are praying, thy kingdom come, as we are accustomed to doing in the Lord's Prayer, and not doing all that we can and all that we are able to hasten its arrival with our doing, not saying. So there's a discrepancy between saying the right things and doing the right things often. Then we are guilty of the grossest hypocrisy. But you have shown disrespect towards the poor man. Does not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? So you're really biting the hand which feeds you if you are rich, if you are poor, and you are demeaning and despising the poor just to covet the favor and the presence and the graces and the generosity of the rich. But this same rich one who has the power to patronize you also has the power to wipe out your livelihood. He has the courts on his side, and he has oppressive potential. So why show favor to them? It is a self-defeating exercise comparable to biting the hand which feeds one, if they exalt the rich at the expense of the poor. You are biting the hand which can feed you, but it can also slap you into misery, greater misery. Do they not blaspheme that good name by which you are called? Now this all amounts to an act of blasphemy, and as name bearers of the namesake of our religion, when we carry the name, that is, when we represent his character, that is a grave responsibility, and any consequences, any deviation in any direction, as he says in the 10th verse, it is still lawlessness. So that is all blasphemy, because remember, we are trying to mimic and represent accurately to a lost and fallen world the impartiality that is consistent with the name sake of our religion, by whom we are called, in whom no partiality dwells, to take it back to the first verse. If you truly accomplish the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. This law is, the scriptural reference points is Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself, but it is also exalted into a royal law because this is commensurate with the kingdom constitution, so this is consistent with the teachings of him who perfectly embodied loving the neighbor as ourselves. So if you are if you are treating the poor as less than yourself, or as someone less than, then you are not loving your neighbor. So this royal law, in this royal law, is summed the entire righteous demands of the Decalogue, commandments 5 through 10. So you will not murder, cheat on, or steal, or any of the other things on your neighbor, or covet his goods, or disrespect your parents if you love them. Love is what it all boils down to. Now, love supersedes the demands of the law, because the law of love, there is no need for any law of Moses where the law of love abides, because if you are exuding the fruit of the Spirit, which also supersedes the law, if you are walking in the Spirit, Paul's 5th chapter of Galatians, then you are embodying the higher ethical ideal that you embrace. So there is the royal, now the law is in some sense all equal, as he makes known in the 10th verse, but here he does speak of a royal law, one that is greater. Now what he's not speaking of, if there's any differentiations in sins, he says they're basically all the same in the 10th verse. We're about to get there. We have one in between, but in the 8th verse he seems to exalt a commandment. This is the second greatest commandment, which is also like the first, which satisfies the sacred laws, the first 4 ones of the Decalogue. But if you show partiality, you commit sin, being found guilty by the law as transgressors. Partiality in the law of Moses as early as Deuteronomy, or most familiar in Deuteronomy 1:17, was a forbidden practice. So favoritism is forbidden because it is by the God who calls us, because it is inconsistent with his own character. He loves us all equally. Rich or poor does not make a dent of a difference to us. He loves us. He all made us, so we are called and commanded to reflect his priorities in our daily interactions. And if we are discriminating on the poor because we don't want to be embarrassed by our association or affiliation with them, then we have transgressed the law, the perfect standard. We are sinning by missing the mark of his intended will that we are to obey. Forever shall guard all the Torah, yet stumble in one point. He is guilty of all. So here's where he reduces all sin to an equivalence, because if you are pulled over for speeding, are you going to rest your case on the fact that you paid taxes? A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, so if you do struggle with any one of the 10, then the other 9 are of no strength and no avail and offer no security if you have that one struggling point this is encouraging the sinner not to think of their sins as less than. So, we all tell white lies as a matter of course. It's something I do. Oftentimes I just walk into it. I don't even think about doing it. It just hits me so quick, and there's not even a temptation to resist. So the same way, but he uses the example eventually between adultery and murder. Now, the murderer may not be guilty of adultery, but the adulterer is not guilty of the murder, but nevertheless they are all equal transgressors and lawbreakers. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." Now if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the Torah. This reference is recognizable in the 20th chapter of Exodus and the 5th of Deuteronomy. This is where the latter of which is the reiteration of the 10 Commandments, the first reference of which is the actual event itself at Mount Sinai. And adultery, that is the act of being married and sleeping with someone else, or sleeping with a married man or woman, and it falls into the larger umbrella category of sexual sin, which also includes fornication. That's just sex before marriage. Homosexuality is another sexual sin, but the one that's explicitly indicated in the Torah is adultery. And also murder. Now there is a difference between killing and murder, and in fact provisions were made for the purveyors of manslaughter. They had sanctuary cities in the nation of Israel to which they could flee for protection when they killed someone on accident. But murder is the deliberate attempt and the maliciously motivated killing of someone, and it's usually related in some other sin, over a woman or over money, so greed, all these other things. So if you're a murderer but you don't commit adultery, then I guess murder is, in some sense, a more devastating degree of sin than anything else. But he's saying that they're all the same, so you cannot rest your case that you do not commit adultery. And the danger and the challenge and the temptation is to hate the sins we do not do while loving the ones that we do. So we cannot be selective or partial to any sin, inasmuch as we are not to be partial to any person. So speak and do as those who are to be judged by a law of freedom. The law of freedom, now, this concept is just counterintuitive. It's paradoxical, because the law is just a list of rules and restrictions and restraints, but there is liberty from sin, its clutches, its bondage. It identifies sin, but the Torah itself offers no liberation from the sin. All it does is exist and point to it. But he who lives by the law will be judged by the same, but we are liberated from the law, Galatians 5:1. But James is writing from a more Jewish perspective than Paul, because he is the apostle to the Gentiles. James was the bishop of Jerusalem, where he the majority of the Christians would have been Jewish, not only in Jerusalem and in Judea, but also across the Mediterranean where it flourished. The first places these people visited were the synagogues until they were expelled finally around the year 50. For the judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy, and mercy boasts over judgment. He who is merciful shall receive mercy. This much is promised in the Beatitudes, Matthew 5:9. I think so. If you will give what you get, you will get what you give. If you are merciful to others, that means you deserve to be treated mercifully by the all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky who sees everything we do. And if we are inclined to mercy and we have a merciful disposition, the one that favors mercy over judgment, now the natural man likes to judge others but doesn't like to be judged. We all want mercy. Not all of us want to give mercy, but those who give, they will get what they give. So this is the law of lex talionis, almost in effect. Also the principle of reaping what you sowing. The Hindus have a similar concept for the moral law of cause and effect that is known as karma, which is almost more prolific in contemporary Western culture as we find it today. But mercy is far too precious a commodity to waste and squander on those who are not merciful themselves from the divine perspective. So this calls us to have mercy over judgment. Hosea 6:6, mercy over sacrifice, mercy above all else if we want to be treated mercifully and spared from the wrath of his judgment. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.